All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a truly fascinating story about transforming a persistent, everyday workplace frustration into an absolute masterclass of practical problem solving. We're going to unpack a case study that perfectly shows how simple, direct observation and just a little bit of mechanical intuition can completely outsmart those complex organizational bottlenecks that drive us all crazy. If you've ever felt like your team is just stuck in this endless loop of complaining with zero actual solutions, well, this story is going to be incredibly refreshing. Let's get right into it. So we start with a highly relatable dilemma. How exactly do you guide a backing truck when the driver simply cannot see? Picture the setup. At a really bustling facility, there's this storekeeper who is constantly complaining because a truck keeps damaging the goods transfer bay. The driver was continually backing up and just bumping the rear of his truck right into the structure. But here's the thing, the driver wasn't actually being careless. He was operating with a massive, unavoidable blind spot. And this quote right here brilliantly captures the tension of the whole situation. The driver literally says, "I can't see from the driver's seat, sir. How to know when to stop?" It is your classic standoff, right? You have the storekeeper who is super frustrated about property damage and a driver who is completely helpless because he physically cannot see to do his job perfectly. The source material tells us this resulted in weekly holchel, which essentially translates to a ton of commotion and uproar. And management, they were completely stumped for months. Nobody had a workable answer. Enter a man named Sammy. Sammy was deputed to the store for a 6-month stint. Now, while management was busy having endless meetings and people were practically yelling at each other down in the transfer bay, Sammy took a totally different approach. He immediately started hunting for a solution hidden away in the archives. He began reading through old reports, specifically looking for resources that the organization had completely forgotten about. Now, while digging through those old reports, Sammy stumbled upon a mention of an incredible asset: 5 tons. That's right, 5 huge tons of hardened rubber. This material was entirely left over from a fire accident that had happened a full year prior. It was fire damaged, it was hardened, and it had literally just been sitting there untouched, taking up space. It had absolutely no buyer and seemingly no apparent use. In fact, the managing director had looked at this massive pile of rubber and gave a very simple directive: just throw it away. To him, it was absolutely useless scrap. But you see, this is where Sammy's unique perspective comes into play. Where the executive leadership saw a really annoying and costly disposal problem, Sammy looked at 5 tons of hardened rubber and saw the exact raw materials he needed to build a precision tool. To execute his vision, Sammy immediately called upon his trusted kinsman and executive hand, a guy named Rayappa. Sammy was absolutely the visionary mind here, but he knew he needed a reliable partner to actually bring his mechanical intuition to life on the ground. This kind of partnership is what the sources refer to as total execution, having that deeply trusted right-hand person who can take precise measurements and ensure the physical layout is flawlessly executed. So let's look at how this actually builds into an ingenious, foolproof system that completely bypasses the driver's need to see. It's brilliant in its simplicity. Samji gave Rayappa precise instructions. First, cut those massive rubber blocks into long, rectangular pieces, specifically 2 meters by 1 foot. Second, lay them down flat on the truck's backing path, spaced evenly, right up until the very last one touches the transfer bay. And finally, and this is the absolute stroke of genius, fix a loud bell that mechanically triggers the second the truck's heavy rear tire climbs up onto that final piece of rubber. The crucial point here is the immediate cascading results of this setup. First off, that useless hardened rubber, perfectly reused. Second, the truck driver, who previously had to just guess blindly, now had a foolproof auditory signal. The second that bell rang, he slammed on the brakes. No need to see a thing. Third, the goods transfer bay was instantly protected from any further damage. And fourth, it resulted in the total overnight elimination of all those weekly complaints and all that commotion. Bam, problem solved. It's a fantastic story, right? But to really get the value out of this explainer, we need to dig a little deeper. Let's break down exactly why Sammy's approach was so extraordinarily effective compared to standard organizational responses. How on earth did he solve in a few days what an entire facility management team couldn't figure out for months? Well, it brilliantly illustrates a massive divide. On one side, you have management talk, months of meetings, people lodging official complaints, endless holchol, but absolutely zero actionable solutions. And on the other side, you have Sammy's ground-level truth. He used direct observation, he analyzed old reports to uncover hidden assets, and he implemented tactile feedback. The sources actually highlight that the chairman frequently relied on Sammy for this exact reason, to cut through all the corporate noise and deliver the ground-level truth, especially when specialized, over-engineered systems totally failed. What Sammy essentially did here can be formally defined as sensory engineering. It sounds fancy, but it's really just the practice of designing tactile and auditory feedback systems to provide crucial information when visual cues are either missing or inadequate. Instead of trying to somehow structurally alter the bay's architecture or wire up the driver's cab with expensive camera systems, Sammy elegantly applied sensory engineering. He replaced visual guesswork with a foolproof physical and auditory signal. These four consistent habits really form the core of his situational intelligence. He was incredibly resourceful with materials everyone else deemed scrap. He leaned heavily on implementing sensory feedback systems rather than jumping to complex tech. He relied on Taldemar execution, meaning he worked with highly trusted, capable partners like Ryapa. And above all else, he prioritized ground-level truth over management theory. Honestly, it's a perfect formula for solving complex problems with incredibly minimal resources. And what is truly remarkable is that this goods-based solution was definitely not an isolated incident. Sammy was known as a walking university. He had this deep, actionable wisdom rooted in direct observation. For example, the sources share this amazing story. One fine day, the MD ordered a new plant nursery to be built near a mountain spring. Now, the route to this nursery, which was about 10 kilometers from the division office, was completely unpaved, filled with gravel, and absolutely covered in brutal potholes. Well, by noon, the MD's relative comes roaring up on his bike, practically screaming because he'd lost his motorcycle's number plate somewhere along the way. Back then, getting a duplicate was a nightmare of procedures and police complaints. The guy was restless, totally frustrated. Sammy happened to overhear this. When Sammy calmly asked him what route he took, the relative just rudely brushed him off. But Sammy pressed him again. Angrily, the guy snapped that he drove from the division office down to the new nursery plot. Sammy simply told him, "Go back and look specifically on that stretch between the division office and the nursery." The guy was totally unconvinced, muttering under his breath, but he went. 2 hours later, he comes back, totally successful, number plate in hand. It had been run over by a gravel truck, but it was still okay. The guy was just in absolute awe, totally ashamed of how he disrespected Sammy, and asked how he possibly calculated that. Sammy just smiled and said, "It's you who gave me the clues." He knew that specific gravel road was terrible, so it was the most logical place for something to rattle loose. Just brilliant practical deduction. And if we look at a timeline of his work, it proves a lifelong pattern of this exact kind of genius. One year, he salvaged a 2-horsepower submersible motor that was marked for scrap just to build a self-contained fountain. Later on, he turned discarded machinery cartons into temporary shades for plantation workers. Another time, and this is wild, he diagnosed a broken fan blade inside a massive 200 kilovolt generator entirely by listening to its abnormal sound. Again, sensory engineering. And then, of course, repurposing 5 tons of hardened rubber into our foolproof signal system. He consistently saw incredible potential in the very things that others eagerly discarded. Which brings us nicely to this high praise from the managing director. "Sammy, you've turned waste into wisdom." That quote perfectly captures the legacy of a man whose direct observation and actionable logic consistently outsmarted complex, systemic organizational challenges. He didn't need high-tech sensors. He didn't need massive budgets. He literally just needed a heavy block of rubber, a loud bell, and the vision to connect the two. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to chew on. Take a look at your own team, your own projects, your own roadblocks. Where is the wasted rubber in your organizational bottlenecks? What overlooked, discarded, or entirely forgotten resources could you repurpose today to solve your most persistent workplace frustrations? Because sometimes the smartest, most effective solution isn't about buying new technology at all. It's just about looking at your scrap pile with a completely new perspective.